Welcome, Wargamers, to the unforgiving wastes of Ea, because today we are talking about the Wadroon, the newest faction for the game Conquest, and I could not be more excited about it, because they have this deeply fascinating history and rich culture, and I'm going to start this series on the Wadroon with a 3-word sales pitch, okay, to get you as excited as I am. Orcs riding dinosaurs. Now that your pulse has sufficiently risen with excitement, I'd like to say that you can save 10% on any of your purchases from Bellum by using my link in the description down below. It is an affiliate link, just to be clear, and it goes an immensely long way to supporting me and my wife and making content like this possible. So thank you to those who have already done so. Now, for those of you who are new to Conquest, first of all, welcome. I have some other videos in my Conquest playlist that will help you get all kinds of caught up, but essentially, this is Bellum's design or take of orcs and casting them into a fresh light, weaving their origins in with the other factions, which goes a long way to making them feel like they really belong in the setting. So with all that preface out of the way, what are the Wadroon? These are, as I said, orc-like creatures. They stand about 7 feet tall, they're full of muscle and designed, that's a key word, designed, from head to toe for war. But we'll get to that in a second. They have a solid fused ribcage, tough skin, and interestingly, one of the most acute senses of hearing of any known creature. That means they're strong, they're resilient, and thanks to their incredible hearing, they can communicate over incredible distances that other races cannot match, which means that they can coordinate their attacks like nobody else. Now, fun fact about that physiology, they actually have more methods to hear than just their ears. They also have sound receptors in their jaws and nasal cavities, which they can focus all to a pinpoint so that they don't get overwhelmed. They can hone in their senses on a specific point so that the din of battle doesn't deafen them and disorient them, but they can hyper-focus to listen to a singular thing. The only real drawback to their build, their physiology, is the sheer amount of energy required to keep it going, meaning they need to slam down an immense amount of food on a daily basis. It does help that they have stomachs that can consume dang near anything. They can eat trash, they could eat wood, all this kinds of stuff, but where they reside, in a harsh desert-like waste of Ea, scarcity is still a very real problem and constantly on their minds, to the point where different tribes will fight and raid one another if starvation reaches that tipping point. But all that said, that's just basic orc stuff. There's a whole lot more going on with this faction. The truth about the Wadroon is that they are a science project run amok, like so many other parts of Conquest. We mentioned in the video on the Nords that they are essentially, their heroes were taken, they had a whole bunch of genetic experiments done on them by the Spires and the Weavers to take local stock, humans, and enhance them to act as a submissive guardian species, right? To outsource the Spire's army. We'll just turn these apes into warriors for us. Because the Spires, they, I guess, just don't have time for war, and so they'll make somebody else good at it and have them be our army. And of course, for the Nords, it didn't pan out very well for them. But the thing about the kind of research amongst the Spires when it comes to manipulating life is that it never goes out of style for them, and the different biomancers and scientists were always refining that idea, the core idea of creating a warrior race to defend them. Even if it didn't work on the Nords, there was still something there. The result of further tinkering was a project where no base animal was used, like humans, for example. Instead, they would be genetically designed from the ground up. This warlike race utterly devoted to the Spire and to basically act as both a meat shield and an incredibly deadly standing army. And it took a long time to hammer out the details because the first few batches just wouldn't have that spark of sentience. Right, they would just be this feral animal, but they wouldn't be able to take commands or create battle plans, nothing like that. They were just too primitive. Until at some point, randomly, specifically 4 Wadroon, known as the Primes, gained sentience. The Spires couldn't understand why these 4 in particular, amongst all the different batches, just all of a sudden gained the spark of life, and they were unable to replicate it. Even when they took the samples from these 4 original Wadroon, they couldn't make it happen again. It's almost like life just had to happen on its own. However, accidental success is still success nonetheless, which is the same approach I had to getting questions right in math class. Now, one thing to note about these 4 primes, as they're called, is that they are actually significantly bigger than the Wadroon that we know in the game. Essentially, these were like, I guess you could call them, jokingly, prime orcs, if you wanted to do that as a 40k joke. But essentially, they were just magnified creations. All the strengths and the drawbacks of their physiology that I mentioned before were just more so. They were bigger, so they were stronger and tougher, but also that meant they had to consume more energy, more calories to be able to keep doing things. So, seeing the potential with these 4 primes that they had created, smaller Wadroon were bred until they reached the consistent 7-foot size we mentioned earlier. And again, this was meant to balance their physical prowess and abilities with how much energy they needed to consume. And so from the Spire's perspective, this is a fantastic success. We got 4 primes that are breeding, and we're continuously pruning how they breed so that we get the perfect size of, creature. This is the start of this new race that we've been working on. We don't really quite understand exactly how it all worked out, but hey, we're working with what we got. But there was one more curious thing about these Wadroon that the Spires just couldn't comprehend. You see, the Spires that we understand in the game have never been able to fully grasp magic. They don't use any, okay? It's prevalent on the planet of Aya, but the Spires use all different kinds of their own macabre technology and like living biomechanisms and that kind of stuff. They don't actually use magic, although they have some stuff that seems similar in the game, is distinctly different. So when these progenitor orcs showed signs of tapping into actual magic, it just made them more fascinating. And they remained in this state of reproducing, testing, and examination for some time. Because the Spires they weren't just gonna like unleash these guys all willy-nilly. They had to build it up into a culture and a people group and establish a hierarchy and all these kinds of things and just try to understand magic and the power of sentience, what made it happen in the first place. There's just a lot of things to learn about them. But that all changes abruptly when the Dweghome, which is sort of the dwarven archetype army that we've talked about here on the channel, went on a warpath and set their sights on the location where the Wadroon project was being held. It is a spire center known as Abhorreth. Now at this point, the Spires are seeing this army coming. They know they don't have the defenses to be able to to make a stand, and so they basically released this fledgling race to defend the site long enough for all the Spire nobles to escape. Now, the battle was a bit rocky until the primes were released. So before this, there's just all the Wadroon. They're kind of scattered, doing little hit-and-run tactics, but not really making a dent in the Dweghome army. But the moment the primes are unleashed, they just immediately galvanize the entire species into a single, cohesive fighting force, cunning and dangerous. There's something about this kind of leadership and magnetism that they have that sets them apart. So at this point, the Spires are running away, the Wadroon are there fighting their first enemy, the Dweghome, and I don't know how long this siege or this battle went on for, but it seems to be, some sort of long amount of time, as the Wadroon kept the Dweghome at bay long enough for everyone to escape, and they were just kind of left to die. Remember, Spires built them for this exact reason, so as long as the research papers made it out, who actually cares about the subjects? We'll just figure out how to recreate them later. Even if it was by accident, we'll figure it out. But the thing is, the Wadroon didn't die. They were beaten, yes, and surrounded, yes. But 3 of those 4 Wadroon primes sacrificed themselves to basically barrel through one flank of Dweghome and open up a pathway for the rest of them to escape into the harsh wastes. They basically sacrificed themselves to create sort of like a rear guard, I guess you could say, for the rest of whatever was left. There's no idea as to how many Wadroon are actually in production, quote unquote, at this time. So we don't know how many like the actual starting race was once they left the Spires. But this is kind of their origin story. And really, once they got out into the wastes, this is when they kind of became a people of their own. The Dweghom didn't chase after them because they weren't the target. If you're the Dweghom Hold Rake, right, the leader, the commander of his army, and you were going to attack some Spire, and all of a sudden these weird green guys showed up and were harassing you, but then they left, you just go back to attacking the Spire. That's why you're here in the first place. And so now, this fledgling race is out in the wastes where many of them are dying. Because they're dying of thirst, starvation, again, the downside of their physique catching up to them. Only one of the 4 primes remained, named Conquest Prime, and after a long time in the desert, she led them to the only place that they ever knew as home, and that is, of course, Abhorreth, the facility that was long since destroyed. But again, it's the site where these experiments were born, and it would be the site that they would become the Wadroon that we understand them to be today. Now I have 3 points here that I really want to stress when it comes to kind of summing up what this faction's about. The first one being is that Abhorreth became an oasis. We talked in the Spires videos that we did about how they would basically store huge amounts of biomass, biomaterial, energy, and all these kinds of things deep underground. Essentially, they have like a root network that draws it all in, and then they use that as materials to create all kinds of things, the Wadroon included. These are their reservoirs of just all kinds of nasty, raw organic material to do all their dark creations. But when the Spire itself, like the actual physical structure of the Spire, was destroyed by the Dweghom, all of that stored material began to leak out and start to greatly enrich the local environment. Remember, the Spire are all about life-giving and mutating power, and so some strange plants started to burst up, forests, water pools, and more. What was meant to be a genetic research plant became an exercise in terraforming by accident. So now we have an environment that is more conducive to life, certainly more so than just wandering the desert like they were, but now the Wadroon have a home, but that home is not quite safe. Because my second point is that the wastes, even with this oasis, are full of life that shouldn't be there. Because the Wadroon were not the only thing being worked on or studied at Abhorreth. When the facility went dark, all those plants and trees began to flourish, but so too did other creatures that were kept in stasis. Some of these animals were farming stock, others were alpha predators, but all of them made this oasis a fearsome place to try and live. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this, my sales pitch was Orcs riding dinosaurs. And this is where that message makes sense. These colossal beasts, reptiles, dinosaurs, and so on were all the other experiments going on there. And they were just unleashed upon one another to kind of make their own food chain. The Wadroon themselves, designed to be tough and adaptable, took to this challenge immediately, right? Some of these creatures were brought into their own society as beasts of burden or mounts, while some others can't really be tamed so much, but they can still be used as like living war machines of their own design. So while they as a species lack the more powerful magics or intense technology of other factions, they have formed creative uses for the various life forms around them to achieve the same result. And lastly, I have a note here, this is where culture was born. Now, I'm going to talk more about the Wadroon culture in a future video, but I wanted to mention it here because this moment, timeline-wise, is where it begins. The Spires didn't preset them with a culture and a hierarchy. They had some experiments about like the primes just being bigger ones and kind of corralling them into groups, but it wasn't a culture. That's very different. And so the primes, and now prime singular, had to craft it. And this is where we see things like a rich warrior tradition come into their lives. They have a tribal society built upon oral traditions, storytellings of their birth and their fight to survive. They revere the warrior, the shaman, the speaker, and they weigh each other's worth by their ability to track and fight and provide sustenance for the tribe. And it's from these kind of seed concepts that the Wadroon race has split into many, many different tribes governed in different ways and valuing different things, but they all have those same core values that permeate all of them. And so I want to close this video with all of my videos the same way, but talking about why is this so cool. And the truth is, I just love this origin story, right? You'll get some folks, I'm sure they're already in the comments, this isn't all that original, right? Friends, there's nothing new under the sun, right? X Game Company already has orcs that were genetically designed by another race. I don't care. I still love it. What makes this different from other settings is how well they fit into the overall story. Because what we're going to see as we go further and further into more W'adrun lore, they are very much interwoven to other races in this setting in a way that I think is fantastic. The W'adrun are a living example of the hubris of the Spire, but they do so in a way that's very differently to the Nords, right? Where like the Nords were a failure. On terms of an experiment. They took the warriors, they genetically modified them, but they were never awoken in time, and so they didn't serve their purpose, and the Spires up there burned for it. Technically, the actual subjects were successful in that they are super powerful demigods, but the overall experiment of creating an army to defend the Spires up there failed because they weren't woken up. Whereas with the W'adrun, if you look at their story, kind of in contrast, they are pure success. These guys are just straight, like the W in W'adrun is also like for win, because they were made for a purpose. They served that purpose. All the Spires were allowed to escape, and then they just kind of kept going, right? They weren't as disposable as maybe the Spires thought they would be, but they certainly were successful. And because of that success, they became independent, which of course was not intentional, but I love it. It's like, when you kind of factor in the fact that the Spire unleashed all these other animals and this vibrant oasis around it, it is like Jurassic Park also made superhumans, and then all the experiments got out, and the humans that they made were like, we should ride dinosaurs, and everyone was like, yeah, brah. Which is a remaking of that movie that we absolutely need to see. But for all these reasons, I find the lore behind the W'adrun absolutely fascinating. They're this kind of mixture of a discarded race, kind of like the Nords are, but they have a much firmer understanding of their origins because the Primes and some of those older W'adrun remember their time in the facility. Like they also have living idols of their past, but where the Nords channel that into, their kind of theology, these guys have turned that into a cunning weapon of survival. And for that, they are utterly awesome. So we're going to talk a whole lot more about their culture. There's a lot to go into because they're able to channel different aspects of like primordial power and all these kinds of things. There's so much more to talk about with this faction, but this is your taster, your primer, and I hope that you enjoyed it. So thank you all so much for watching and listening. Like I said before, there is an affiliate link down below if you want to check out some of their models. And every purchase through that link helps support the channel. And if there's enough support for it, I'll keep on doing more and more Warcry content. So I'm excited for it. I love this game. I hope it does really well. And I hope that you enjoy learning more about the W'adrun. Take it easy, y'all, and happy wargaming.